everyone, this is Rachel over at Salsa. Thanks for joining our partner pep talk today with our friends over at Media Cause. We're really excited about this topic. I think even myself, I'm going to learn something new from our two hosts, which they'll introduce themselves in just a minute here. It's two Sarahs. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. Some housekeeping things before we get started. Everyone will get a recording of today's partner pep talk, along with a copy of the slide deck that we're going to be going through. So look out for that from your email, in your email later today. Also, everyone is muted on today's webinar. So if you have a question, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions that come through, feel free to use the questions box in your GoToMeeting control panel. As questions come to you throughout the presentation, go ahead and chat those in. If I can answer them by just chatting you back, I will. Otherwise, we have some time at the end where we can ask Sarah to answer those for us. And then real quick, just before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay, and that also the screen is being shared. You should see the first slide there. If you can just chat in that you can both see and hear me, that would be great. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, guys. I will pass it over to Sarah now. Take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be here and to talk about how to more deeply understand who your supporters are by looking at the data and walking you through a bit of our process to actually build out audience personas for your supporters, kind of based on what your overall communications goals are. So first wanted to do a quick intro to me and to Sarah. So you will be joined by two Sarahs today. So my name is Sarah Swan, and I'm a marketing manager here at Media Cause. And so a bit of background on Media Cause. So we're a digital marketing agency that works with really any organizations that are looking to do good in the world to help them scale their impact through digital channels. So I'm joined by Sarah Trubiano, who's my colleague here in Boston, and she's an account director, and she has a ton of experience with audience research and persona development, working with organizations across different sectors and causes, different sizes. So really excited to have her here today as well to kind of share her expertise. But yeah, so if Sarah, you wanted to say hello quickly.
Hello, I'm really excited to be joining you all for this webinar and kind of share our knowledge into persona development.
Great, so a little bit on kind of what we're going to be covering today. So first, we're going to do a bit of an overview on what persona development is and why you should care about it, and why it's something that's really important for nonprofits and for-profits alike when it comes to developing very clear communication streams and strategies. And then we'll dive into kind of what the data collection and analysis component of persona development might look like. This can be very flexible, kind of depending on your capacity as an organization, but we'll dive into some strategies for organizations with all kinds of different resources. And then we'll walk you through the persona development process and give you some insight into what audience personas can look like. And then some strategies as well for actually activating those personas. So, you know, it's obviously good to have a solid understanding of who makes up your audience, but then how do you actually leverage that knowledge to activate those people and help kind of drive meaningful actions that impact your mission and your programs. So first, what is a persona? So we have a few different definitions here that we really like. One being a user persona is a fictional representation of your ideal customer or your ideal supporter. A persona is generally based on user research and incorporates the needs, goals, and observed behavior patterns of your target audience. Another example, a persona should be an amalgamation of a group of people so that the individual biases are smoothed out and what remains are their unifying hopes, needs, and concerns. So essentially, and I nerd out over this a lot because I really love psychology and kind of the intersection of marketing and psychology, and this is really where it is. It's kind of the psychology of human behavior intersected with very segmented marketing strategies, essentially. But just as importantly as what a persona is also what a persona is not. So a persona is not a rigid mold that all of your constituents need to fit cleanly within. So one person could easily fit into multiple audience personas, whether it's depending on kind of their life stage or their interests at that time. But we're not saying at all that any one audience member is going to potentially fit rigidly within a persona group. But it's more a way to just allow you to more deliberately communicate with your audience based on what you know about them. But it's also not a completely separate communication strategy or a completely separate audience outside of kind of who your supporters are and maybe who your prospective supporters might be. But really, it's a way to kind of segment your audience and maybe treat these segments a little bit differently, whether that's through the way that you message to them or, perhaps the type of imagery that they might see when they're coming to a website or a piece of content. But it is in no means a need for a completely separate communication strategy. It's also not something that's set in stone. So personas are more of a hypothesis, if you will, and you want to be able to test those. So these are kind of assumptions based on the data that you do have at your disposal, that then these assumptions need to be tested, and they can continue to evolve over time depending on what you're able to learn about your audience and depending on the data that you're then able to collect over time. So we know what personas are, but what actually is persona development? So really, persona development is using that research that you do have to kind of define those distinct profiles. You can use those to guide your marketing strategies, but also to help you achieve your organizational goals more efficiently and effectively. So really, it's a process for creating an actionable output format for that audience research that you go through. So we're going to dive a lot more into this in our next section and really kind of talking about those research strategies. But persona development is essentially the process, so that in-between step between the research and then your segmented marketing strategies. So phase one, that data collection and analysis, you want to kind of start with the questions that you really ultimately want to answer about your key constituent segments in order to move them towards specific outcomes, determine your own data opportunities and limitations, and kind of map out what your data collection plan might look like if you're looking to source additional audience data outside of what you already have. And then part of this process too is actually then analyzing that audience data to find those unifying themes and key differentiators between different audience groups. So in a minute, Sarah will kind of walk you through some strategies and suggestions that we have for the research and data collection phase, which is definitely the heaviest lift in terms of this process. And the second phase is the persona development phase. So after you've collected and analyzed your data, teasing out those kind of key differentiators for your audience profiles. So grouping them by different demographic data, psychographic data, even behavioral insights, basically getting a full picture of who your different audience segments are and actually humanizing them too, because each supporter is an individual human being and you want to be able to treat them as such, kind of especially with all of the tools that we have at our disposal today online to really personalize our communications. That's really where this persona development also comes into play. And then lastly, we'll walk you through some of those activation strategies as this third phase of the persona development process, which is actually going out and testing these personas, these assumptions through targeted campaigns and other types of content.
Yes, so phase one of a persona development project is always data collection and analysis, and we feel that this is the most important part of a persona development project because this is where you get all those insights and the data to back it up to build out all your persona profiles and then the corresponding segment and strategies. So the starting point with your data collection and analysis is to really map out your data plan. And number one is to start with your goals. So make sure kind of everyone involved is aligned on what constituent audience you're ultimately trying to grow or engage more deeply. So are you looking to grow just your major donors, or are you looking to grow your supporter list overall? Or maybe you're looking to find more programmatic participants. So making sure everyone's aligned on kind of the specific constituent base that you want to dive deeper into. And then number two is, how do you ultimately want to activate these personas? So whenever you're diving into data in any case, you want to know what questions you ultimately want to be answering in order to achieve your project goals. You know, with digital marketing, there's so much data all over the place, it's almost overwhelming. So you want to make sure you're being intentional about you know, what data you're collecting or diving into to make sure it's actually going to answer those questions for you, and also so you don't waste too much time down different rabbit holes. On the flip side of that, you want to also understand your data limitations. So, you know, what types of resources, time really being the biggest one, do you have available to dedicate? And then understanding what data you already have readily available versus what data might be new data that you need to collect. So a lot of orgs, I think, don't realize that they do have a lot of audience data at their disposal already. And so we just mapped out some ideas for existing data that you could use to inform your persona development research. So number one is website audience insights. So thinking about tools like Google Analytics, which has an interest and affinity drill down to look at or to provide some insight into who your website visitors are. Same thing, social platform audience insights in your admin view offer a lot of insight into demographics, interests, affinities to other organizations, and things like that. Then you have your CRM data. So what types of data have you collected in your CRM? What do you know, what lives in there that you already know about your different audiences? And web, email, and social performance data is also really helpful to analyze in a persona development process because it can help you understand what content is resonating most with your different audiences, what messaging based on past performance of posts and emails. And then in terms of qualitative collection, online reviews and testimonials are really, really informative and helpful and insightful to, if you have the time to kind of read through all of them, to pull out some of those recurring themes around motivations and why people engage with your organization. By the same token, social audience comments and posts, you know, looking into the sentiment and what people are saying when they're mentioning you or responding to posts on your page, what things they care about, you know, and why they're engaging with you. And then just some other sources. So market research reports and articles are always great, especially when you're trying to identify opportunity personas, people that might not be within your existing data that you're capturing, but who would be a good fit that you might want to, you know, start thinking about going out and reaching. And then good old-fashioned online stalking with a disclaimer here. We 100% respect people's privacies, and we're not saying to invade anyone's privacy. But if you don't have the resources available to conduct like a focus group or one-on-one interviews to dive deeper into individuals who are kind of your key constituents for a project like this, you can always pull kind of highly engaged names from your CRM and look at public-facing social profiles to see what they're posting about and engaging with, to gain some insight into what they really care about and who they are. And so those are all examples of data that you might already have at your fingertips to mine for a persona development project. When you're thinking about new data sources, the two main methods we use in our persona development are community surveys and then one-on-one stakeholder interviews. You could also do a focus group as well. With community surveys, they're typically sent to either an entire audience or a specific audience segment via email. But don't forget that you can also generate survey responses from your web and social audiences as well to reach beyond just your email list. With one-on-one stakeholder interviews, they could be either internal, talking to staff or leadership, or external, so talking to those constituents who you're actually trying to build profiles around, your donors, volunteers, members, or you could have a mix of both. Because surveys and interviews are kind of the most time-intensive aspect of data collection, if you choose to do them, just some tips to think about to, you know, how to approach these things. So your questions will obviously be unique to your organization and your specific project goals, but generally should cover general background, you know, demographics, relationship and history with your organization. So how did they first find you? How are they involved now? How has that relationship evolved? And then digital behaviors and media consumption trends. So where are they online? How do they like to get their news? Those types of things that can be leveraged as part of a communication strategy down the line. Make sure you're prioritizing questions based on how valuable response data will be to project goals. Again, just reiterating, always start with what you want to get out when you're putting information in. So especially with surveys, you want to keep those, you know, short and concise. Don't clutter them up with questions where you get your survey data back and you're like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with these answers. Make sure it's stuff that's intentional and really is going to inform or give you valuable data to inform your project goals and strategy development down the line. Community segments surveyed and interviewed should reflect different audience segments based on persona project goals. So if you're looking to grow just all your donors in general, make sure you have a good mix of people that you're surveying and talking to that include, for example, annual gift donors and monthly donors versus major donor and lower level donors, just so that you're getting a good mix to understand the full pool that you're working with. And then make sure to include open-ended questions in a survey for qualitative data, as well as to allow people to expand on their answers when you're conducting an interview.
Yeah, and one other point to make here as well is just to make sure to include every team at your organization that should be involved with this process kind of in the question development process as well, just to make sure that, for example, if you need your program team involved or something like that, just making sure that they also have a stake in kind of the questions that are being proposed to your audiences, just to make sure that you're able to Sarah's point, to make sure you're getting the most valuable response data that you can.
So once you've done all your data mining and collecting, the next step is to pull out your high-level learnings. So before you drill into your more granular segmentation of distinct persona profiles, developing sort of an overarching audience profile that includes common traits and unifying or recurring themes across all of your research and segments, and especially that top line motivation, which we think of as that big picture why for whatever the key action you're looking to drive is with a specific segment. So why do you give, why do you volunteer, why do you participate, those types of whys, followed by kind of your primary and secondary messaging appeals. So based on the recurring motivations and themes and whys that you're hearing, outlining them based on, here are the primary recurring ones, and then here are some secondary ones that only some people said, and those are going to come in handy when you're building out your persona at individual profiles. And when we say high level or unified findings across all audiences, it can be as simple as this example here, which is for an organization that we did an actual persona development project for. What are those key things that are common among everyone you spoke with or surveyed, or the digital data on your online audiences that you collected? Things like, they're all highly educated or have corporate careers, things like that. It doesn't have to be super deep dive, but kind of those high level common traits.
Right, and you might not have all of this data right now at your disposal in your CRM, for example, but going out and sourcing additional data through surveys and interviews can help you kind of get here. But there's also a lot of data that's available on your social platforms, in audience insights, for example, on Facebook, that can actually give you some more of this type of information, whether it's education levels or kind of what life stage they're in, or any of those like affinity audiences that they might fall into. Those types of things are available on social platforms as well. So a lot of this you can get at without necessarily going out and sourcing more data, although of course the more data the better.
And then again, an example of kind of rolling everything up into those high level themes. In this case, we're looking at growing donors, so we're looking at the key motivators to give, but in general, key motivators for whatever the action might be you're looking to drive. Word clouds are super helpful in these scenarios, but basically mapping out down to kind of the key words and phrases that people kept repeating and organizing and categorizing them to basically drill into what are those sort of key recurring themes for why people support or engage with your organization.
Perfect. So now we'll jump into kind of the next phase. So once you're able to pull all of your data together and start to pull out and tease out some of those high-level insights about who might be part of your audience, is then to go out and actually develop distinct audience profiles based on that data. So interestingly enough, this part of the process is actually kind of the easiest, but also the most, the most interesting piece, where you're able to almost put a face to who your supporters are, and start to look at them at the individual level, to kind of pull out those themes that then will apply to your broader audience segments. So kind of looking at the anatomy of a persona profile, really what we are doing is humanizing your audience based on the data that we're able to take a look at through the various data sources that we do have. So super simple, you want to give your persona a name. So whether that's something that's, the name is specific to the audience segment that they might fit in, or you're giving them an actual person's name, can kind of be dependent on what you'd like to do, but giving them a name and then also a photo to kind of allow you to envision what this person might look like in the real world. You can pull in their job role and their function. And then really importantly is pulling in a lot of that background information, including that demographic information, their interests, their life stage, basically kind of what makes them tick as a human being. And then pulling out some of those key motivators, as Sarah mentioned. So reasons that they might get involved with your organization, or why they really see value in being involved with your organization. What motivates them, either to get involved or to take some of those deeper actions that really help your bottom line in fulfilling your mission. But also, what are their goals? So as an organization, you want to be able to help these individuals, these audience members, feel like they're achieving some personal goals of their own. But also, what are some challenges or barriers that they might face in this particular, whether it's within their life stage or something like that, what are those challenges or barriers that, you know, might impact their ability to actually get involved with your organization? Because knowing those types of things can help you figure out how to break down those barriers and help them solve some of their own challenges. And then what are the real key selling points? So this will kind of drive the messaging strategies that you might have for these audience members for a specific persona. Is what are those selling points? Kind of the answering that "what's in it for me" question, and that can really help you determine you know, what your strategy might be when speaking to one persona versus another. So, you know, you're dealing with a ton of data from a lot of different sources. So a lot of, you know, qualitative and quantitative data, but then when it's rolled up, it's really quite simple in terms of kind of pulling out those key insights and attributing them to these different persona segments. So we have a few examples of personas that we've created for partner organizations in the past, just to give you a bit of insight to be able to visualize kind of what this might look like. So this first example here is for a women's empowerment organization that works to move the needle on gender equality and violence prevention through education and education scholarships. So, you know, we were looking into, you know, their audience insights and found that really, you know, there were a lot of different entry points and interests for their supporters, you know, kind of coming in the door, whether they were, you know, motivated more by the violence prevention or motivated more by access to education as that relates to gender equality. But what we did find was that a lot, you know, what unified these different audience segments was a lot more about kind of their life stage and kind of where, you know, where they were in their life and kind of what resources they had available to dedicate to getting involved with this organization. But you'll see in this example here, even with their interests, we were able to pull, these are actually, you know, what are they interested in? What are they following on Facebook? And is that similar to kind of the organization that they're involved with, or is this, you know, different? Their key motivators were actually pulled directly from an audience survey that we had sent out, in addition to their barriers. So there are a lot of different ways to get at this data, but what we see here is kind of a bigger picture of what an audience member within this persona might look like, and kind of the common themes around this audience. And another example here for an education organization, we were doing some audience research to kind of figure out what motivates people to apply for this program and what helps them to succeed. So again, we were figuring out kind of what their life stage was, you know, why they're potentially looking to get involved with this program, and what are those selling points and those lead messaging points. We have some quotes here as well, sourced from past surveys that had been sent out. So again, think about any data that you might have from past surveys that you sent out to your supporters as well. But really, again, we're painting that bigger picture for what motivates this audience.
So once you have your persona profiles all developed and laid out, the important part is the activation, because it's great to have on paper these nice fancy profiles, but if you don't do anything with them, they're not really offering you value. So to think through what persona activation looks like, it's really developing strategies based on your personas. And they could be content and messaging strategies. So what are the lead messaging points and appeals that resonate most strongly with each persona that you've created? And then what content themes are most relevant for each persona? What are they most interested in hearing from you? Channel activation. So we talked a little bit about data collection, asking questions around digital behaviors, and obviously that's information you can also get some analytical insight into from your existing channels as well. But understanding what are the primary and secondary channels that are most effective for one, reaching these particular audiences in the first place, recruiting them, and then engaging and deepening that relationship, and then finally converting each persona. Additionally, thinking about conversion, pass, and funnel phase stages for each of your personas. So a lot of times what we'll see is, one persona might be easy to recruit, but they're going to take a much longer time to convert because they need just more education about your organization and why they should get involved. Whereas some personas are more difficult to recruit and harder to find, but they're more ripe for conversion once you find them. So understanding what those paths look like and how many touch points you need to conversion and things like that by persona. And then a testing plan. So this would be a direct next step for short-term implementation and data gathering. So we mentioned personas are really hypotheses to be tested. You want to always, keep measuring and evaluating. So you might come up with 6 or 7 personas and then implement, for example, a paid lead gen campaign to test them out and determine, okay, these 4 are really solid and we saw good results, and these other 2 not so much. So we're going to kind of scrape them from our additional efforts. But that's kind of a testing plan is a great, if you have the resources, is a great kind of first next step to set yourself up and further refine your ongoing strategies by persona.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, Sarah. Not all of the personas that you develop need to be tested right away or need to be kind of identified as priority. Once you go through this process, you might identify a few that are really high impact that you want to try to source more of these types of people right away. And then you might identify too some kind of stretch or goal personas that might, they might not fit directly with kind of what you have now to offer them in terms of kind of shared value, but it could be a reach audience for you down the line as you start to kind of refine your different communications and audience strategies. So there are definitely kind of different levels of personas as well, and we like to, when we can, kind of think about what that reach might be and how do we get to that reach audience.
So this is just kind of breaks down how we look at a persona activation funnel. We love funnels. Mm-hmm. So that starting point is the reach and capture, and the understanding the motivations and behaviors and characteristics of your audiences so that you can tailor your approach of how to go out and reach them, starting with where to find them. And then what is that kind of key selling point that makes them take some sort of initial step, whether it's just an email submit or something like that. And then phase 2, engage and nurture. So this is where you're deepening the relationship, providing them content and framing it with the messaging that resonates most with them through the right touch points based on what you know about this audience in order for them to continue coming back, to continue reading your content and take smaller actions along the way. And then the final phase is making the ask. And the language on the slide is written more so for donations, but we think of make the ask in terms of whatever that action you want this person to take, the ultimate action to be. So if it's to sign up to become a volunteer, think of this in terms of making that ask. But from what you learn about your audiences along the way, being able to know when the right time is to make that conversion ask and how to make the ask in the right way. So again, thinking back to the insight into what these personas really care about and what makes them tick, and aligning what you're asking them to do in a way that resonates with those things.
Yeah, so we wanted to provide you with some examples for how you could kind of look at this persona activation funnel, because obviously this is going to look different for every organization, kind of based on what your goals are, based on what channels you're on, and kind of where your content priorities lie, and kind of what resources you do have available. So we wanted to, in order to kind of get you all thinking in this funnel mindset, we'll walk walk you through just a few practical examples of how persona marketing can be actualized in real life, kind of from that reach and capture stage all the way down to making the ask. Because really what the whole goal of persona development is just to allow you to be more deliberate with the communications that you're sending out and the messages that you're engaging with your supporters, and then to allow you to be more effective with your time and more efficient with the asks that you're then making down the line. So if we're thinking about kind of that reach and engage stage, thinking about kind of the content that you do have at your disposal, whether it's optimized for SEO, but really taking stock of the content either that you already have on your website, on your social channels, taking stock of that content, or thinking about kind of what's in the pipeline, in the next few months or so in terms of the content that we'll be developing, and being very deliberate in thinking about what audiences are these pieces of content speaking to. So this is an example from our partners at Year Up. So we had gone through an audience discovery and persona development phase with them, and we had identified a few key audiences. And these were all unified kind of around their different life stages, but as well as their motivators for getting involved with Year Up. So we have these different student stories here, these success stories of students coming out of their programs and seeing success and kind of taking their careers to the next level. But all of these individuals have different entry points for getting involved with Year Up. For example, someone might have gone to a four-year college but then not been able to complete it and are now looking to continue their education. So a college tryout. And so there's a story here from a real student, a real person who kind of fits within that persona bucket. And basically, what this can do is any prospective audience member or supporter coming in and reading this content, they want to be able to see themselves somehow or make a connection somehow to this piece of content. So for this strategy specifically, it's featuring different students who have seen success through these different entry points that relate directly back to personas that we had identified. So a very clear example of kind of having that targeted content kind of based on who your personas are and making sure to tailor that content to your personas. Another example, if we're thinking about actually investing some money, or for example, or for this, with your Google Ad Grant, actually putting some paid spend behind any media that you're on, is actually going out and trying to find new audience members by speaking to them in a way that you know will resonate with them. So for this example, another education organization have identified different audience segments of teachers. So kind of based on what their main motivators are, what their main goals are as professionals. And so for this first example, we had identified student-focused teachers. So teachers who are really focused on the outcomes for their students. And so this organization is sharing different ads that are related to this content on the right, and trying to deliberately drive these student-focused teachers to content that will resonate with them and that's also primed for some sort of lead capture. And then on the flip side of that, they also identified teachers who are really focused more on the curriculum. And for to reach these personas, they're talking a lot more about the lesson plans and the curriculum here. They're not using any language necessarily as much surrounding students as it is about helping with these Common Core lesson plans, and here are some free materials. So again, it's very nuanced. You wouldn't necessarily notice that these are speaking to different audiences until you're able to kind of look at them next to each other. But being able to pair your ad grant with targeted landing pages, kind of based on what you know about your audience and what's going to interest them and get them in the door, and then using those landing pages to kind of seal the deal, right? So having imagery and messaging that very much speaks to the audience, kind of based on what you've identified for those persona segments.
So email engagement, there's a lot of benefits of persona development and segmenting by persona to inform your email segmentation and personalization strategy. So number one is using what you've learned about your audience personas to draw people into different email segments or workflows to connect them with the content they're most interested in and the messaging that's most relevant to them. I think sometimes when we talk about email segmentation strategies as you know, an angle of persona development, I think people get a little intimidated by that because you're like, well, we have all these people already on our list and we don't know like what specific persona they fit into. So how are we supposed to segment by a specific persona? And the answer is you don't need to. But think through what you've learned about your audiences through your persona development, and then think about what you can segment on already by who's in your on your email list. So segmenting by interest, and whether that's if someone checked off a particular interest when signing up or interest category when signing up for your newsletter, or if you're able to segment by engagement indicators for particular content. So if someone's consistently you know, opening emails and engaging with content related to whatever category, you can sort of segment them into one bucket. You can also segment by demographics if you have that data collected and available, and it aligns with kind of how you're looking at your different persona audiences on a larger level. And then there's more sort of involvement and engagement-based ways to segment people by. So for example, segment by donor capacity or by status, how the person's actually involved in your organization. And then beyond that, using your personas to drive the actual content of your emails that people receive. And so this is really important. You know, talking to people like you know them, essentially. So using imagery and personalization, messaging, and ultimately framing the way you're asking them to engage or get involved based on what you know resonates most with them and what you know they care most about. So, you know, making sure that you're not only offering them the content that they're interested in, but framing it in a way that resonates most strongly.
Yeah, and this is really important because this brings us then to the ask. So if you're really effective in incorporating your audience personas into your overall, you know, segmentation strategy and communication strategy, really the bottom line here is that it can make your asks that much more effective, regardless of what you're asking someone to do, because you're able to understand kind of what those different trigger points are for these different audiences. And, you know, as Sarah had mentioned before, you might have some personas that you know, they might be really, you know, they might say yes right away to getting involved, but then actually, you know, nurturing them to take any meaningful actions might take a lot more time. But then you might have those personas that it takes a really long time to find them, but once you bring them into your community, they're totally bought in. But the really important thing here is that either way, you already understand that, or you're starting to learn that about your audience because you've defined who they are based on the data, and then you're actively going out to source more of these types of people and to bring in more of that data to help you be even more effective. So you have all these different touch points with these different persona audiences, but really the important piece is being able to serve those audiences with the right message on the right channel at the right time. So you've identified those messaging strategies, you figured out where these audiences hang out, what digital channels they prefer to consume any sort of content, and then you can present them with the content that's most relevant to them and that resonates with them. You can also consider, you know, making incrementally larger asks along your persona nurturing paths. So what might an ask string look like for one persona segment versus another? So on the right here, we have an example where this organization is asking someone to make a pledge to end violence against women, to get involved in the cause. And so this email, you know, it's tailored to the persona, but it's also it's relevant to multiple personas here. So they have an empowered survivor persona, but they also have that modern feminist persona. So serving up an action that's relevant, that they've identified as relevant to these different persona groups. But, they're not asking for money right now. They're just asking for someone to raise their hand and say they're invested in this cause. So sometimes it can be really helpful when you're kind of thinking about what the ask might look like to actually kind of map out your ask strings for each persona segment. So this example here is, we're not asking, even all the way at, the 5th email where we're nurturing these personas, we're not yet even asking for a donation. So these are very small asks, kind of taking people from one step to the next, but always making sure to keep them engaged and always kind of having that call to action and making sure that that call to action is very relevant to that persona audience based on what you know about them. So for example, if you're taking someone down a nurturing path kind of based on what their subject matter interests might be in your organization, that could look very different for when you're talking about one program versus another. So outlining what those actions might look like and how to really measure how engaged different audience members are at these different touch points can be super helpful in just kind of visualizing what it might look like, but then also identifying what messaging you might use for each stage and all of that. And then lastly, once you have your personas defined and you've started to figure out ways to activate them on the different channels that you have available, as we've mentioned, personas are hypotheses, they're theories, kind of based on the data that you do have available. But what's really important is to kind of keep testing out these different personas and refining them as you learn more about them. So we really recommend giving yourself plenty of opportunities to collect more data and kind of think about what data you're already collecting in the background without necessarily, getting too granular. But looking at content engagement. So what types of content does each persona engage with the most? So if you have a specific persona segment on your email list, what types of emails are they engaging with, or what types of content are they clicking on within emails? Those types of things can help you get really granular in terms of your segmentation. And then you can also start to notice different patterns of what types of appeals each personas are most likely to respond to. So over time, as you're able to see more of that type of engagement with your content, now that you have your personas defined, is taking those learnings and creating an action plan out of them. So if you notice that one persona group is really responding well to a certain type of appeal, testing more of those types of appeals, you can then collect more data to figure out how to be most effective. And then continuing to collect data kind of outside of what's already going on within your CRM, within your social channels, thinking about other ways to kind of source additional data over time. So some things we've already mentioned, thinking about doing surveys, but also even offering different content downloads or resources to supporters coming to your website, and potentially adding in a few extra question fields when they're hitting submit. So whether that's asking for their job title or their function or something completely random that would really help you in being more effective in your communications, add some of those questions in every now and again to get more data. You can also think about doing something fun like a fun quiz where someone's given a result at the end, but really, you're able to collect a lot of really important and impactful data through those quizzes, or short and easy things like polls, whether that's on social media or elsewhere. There are a lot of different ways to continue collecting data, kind of even after the persona development process has been completed, because we kind of like to say that it's never fully complete, because it's you're always going to be testing and kind of optimizing based on what that data tells you. Okay, so we've definitely covered a lot in this time. Persona development can be a very involved process, but it's one that's super impactful and I think important, because it really does just allow you to be so much more deliberate with how you're communicating with people, and it allows them to feel like they really have a kind of a stake in the direction of your organization, and that they're really making an impact as individuals by being able to talk to them in a much more one-to-one and human way. So this is something that we get really excited about when we're working with organizations on these types of projects. And yeah, would love to hear any questions that might have come up over the last 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah and Sarah. I think this was a really great webinar. We know we have a lot of different types of organizations on today's session, but I think that this is a topic that obviously applies to everyone. You all have to know who you're talking to and how to best reach them so that people are taking action. We have had a couple questions come through, some really good questions. So the first one is, how often should you perform this? We had a consultant do something like this 4 to 5 years ago, and I'm wondering if we need to do it again.
I would say, so we approach persona development as like an ongoing and evolving process. I would say if those personas were developed and there wasn't any like measurable strategy implemented around them, it might be time to refresh them or kind of reinvest in like that deep dive persona creation, just because in the case that you haven't been gathering data on these personas over time, you don't necessarily know how effective each one is or how kind of accurate each one is, because again, like we mentioned, these are all hypotheses that you test over time, especially in the context of how well they perform towards getting specific organizational actions completed. So if there hasn't been a measurable plan to kind of capture data to help you understand that over the last 5 years, it would definitely be worth refreshing those before kind of implementing any new strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've definitely worked with organizations in the past where they might have, personas that have been developed a while back, but to Sarah's point, hadn't necessarily gone out and tested and refined those. And so, sometimes we'll start out a persona development project with kind of past personas in mind, and that's, it's helpful and informative to kind of understand what those personas might have looked like, but then, given the additional data that we have, kind of how have those changed over time, or have some stayed the same?
Okay, perfect. Thank you both for that. Here's another question that I think I can answer. Megan is asking if Salsa Engage can help in developing these personas. So absolutely, Megan, you can use the queries that we have built into Salsa Engage to gather some of the data points that Sarah pointed out. High donors, low donors, how they are getting onto your donation page or your petition page. Those sources of the supporter will help you segment those, and you can put those people into groups. So whether you have a static group, which would be a group that you're just going to use one time, or you can set groups up to be the dynamic groups, which would essentially be creating the criteria for the group, and then anyone who meets that criteria will automatically be put into that group. So you can use the groups to create these personas based on the data points that Engage is collecting from email opens, donation amounts, petition signs, things like that. Okay, here's another question from Paula. This will be for you, Sarah. Do you take the organization through the whole process? If so, what is the average time frame to do so? So would you offer this service to organizations who might be interested?
Yes,
definitely.
We do a lot of persona development projects, and normally, so sometimes it's part of a larger discovery process with a client, which is a deep dive not only into your audiences, but also an audit of all your social channels, your email, your website, all of that kind of stuff. A one-off persona project would probably take about a month. I would say the one caveat to that is it's always more difficult to get in one-on-one interviews scheduled than you think it's going to be. So sometimes that skews the timeline a bit, but I think, like a 4-week persona development project is is pretty standard, and yeah, it's absolutely something we at Media Cause offer as a service and something we do a lot of.
Yeah, and we work with organizations on, everything from, that first point of understanding what the goals are and kind of which, constituent audiences you're looking to grow, kind of through the process of, so we tend to do, depending on the scope, we tend to do, full-on audience surveys as well as one-on-one interviews, and we're working, hand in hand with organizations to kind of develop those different questions that we want to be asking. So we definitely did, a bit of a high-level walkthrough of kind of what that process looks like, but we definitely get pretty in the weeds with the data, and it's a lot of fun.
I would encourage everyone on the call today to go ahead and take a look at Media Cause's website. They do a fantastic job. They've worked with a number of different SALSA clients, and we work really well with Media Cause. We have a good partnership going, so I would send everyone their way just to see what they offer. They really do a fantastic job. Speaking of organizations that Media Cause works with, we've got a question here. Really on what types of organizations do you work with? Specifically, do you work with Christian organizations? Anything like that?
So we're pretty we don't have a type. We work with any organization. The one criteria that we kind of filter on is whether they're making an impact in the world. So
positive impact.
Yeah, positive impact in the world. So I think I'm trying, off the top of my head, I'm trying to think if we have any Christian.
I don't know if we have any Christian organizations that we could point to that we're working with right now. But I will say that, as Sarah mentioned, like any organizations that are working to create a positive social impact, we've definitely worked with organizations that might have a bit of a religious ties or religious leanings, but they tend to be, kind of charities or kind of awareness organizations. So yeah, it's definitely it's a very simple criteria. But yeah, we work with all range of organizations in terms of kind of the specific cause area, the types of work they do in the field, the organization size. So it's very, very broad in that way.
Yes, and we always get excited to dive into a new sector, a new type of organization that we haven't worked with. Our methodology is really to learn everything there is to know about the specific organization and their audience and their world in order to do our job most effectively. So we don't kind of get ourselves into kind of any type of niche area.
Okay, perfect. One last question I think is probably all we'll have time for, but this is also a good question that I like. So we talked about creating these whole personas and kind of the process that a nonprofit would go through, but do you have any recommendations for maybe an abbreviated version, or rather what a small nonprofit could handle in terms of just having maybe no real full-time staff? What would be realistic when it comes to personas if they don't have a lot of heavy time? Is there a certain part of this process that you would recommend doing to maybe just help get a start to it? Is there any type of light version of this process that you could recommend?
Yeah, I would say to definitely just start with the kind of the data that you already have at your disposal. Maybe even to just be able to iron out some high level like demographic insights and things like that. So kind of to understand a little more about, if a certain audience or a certain audience member fits within this demographic group, are they engaging differently with our content or with our organization than potentially a different audience segment with, falling into different demographic categories. So that's something that if you have like Google Analytics on your website or anything like that, or if you're active on any social channels, that type of data is readily available to you. So it can be kind of a good first step. And I would encourage to kind of check out some of the other affinity data that Google Analytics and Facebook specifically can provide on your audiences, because then you can start to kind of round out and do a bit of slicing and dicing of that data to understand what might interest someone in one segment versus another. So I think it's, starting with the data that you do have to kind of pull out super high level insights. But then, as we've mentioned, personas are assumptions. They tend to be based on data, but if you have a decent understanding of who some of your what some of your audience segments might look like, kind of just based on your overall understanding of who your supporters are currently, that can also be a good place to start, because then you're able to, maybe look into a few of those assumed audience personas and maybe get together with a few people on your team to start to think about, okay, well, what might a nurturing path look like for them, and how would we message to them based on what we know about them? And so whether that's, again, just a demographic group that they fall into, or specific interests that they might have, it can be pretty simple. And again, a lot of it's an assumption that you then over time are going to refine based on how people respond to your different messaging points. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I was just going to Sarah's point. So what we walked through today was all about database personas, but I think sometimes, especially smaller orgs, you don't necessarily have all of that data at your disposal, and you also do not have time to look at it all. Mm-hmm. So like Sarah mentioned, the non-data based personas would be you and some other maybe internal stakeholders kind of brainstorming about what do we already know, mm-hmm. About our audience or audiences, and kind of mapping out what those kind of key things are that you do know to develop some initial rough personas that could help inform the way you're messaging to different groups. And then you'd obviously want to continue to refine and move from there. And we kind of always say, like Sarah mentioned, sometimes orgs will come to us and they have some existing personas, but I sometimes call them assumption-based personas, because mm-hmm. when we redo the project, we want to test those assumptions with data, and maybe there's someone you missed or you weren't aware of, or maybe you had this one, kind of wrong, or you didn't realize they cared about this. So I think, but that doesn't mean you can't start with assumption-based personas, because mm-hmm. the thing is, it's a starting point, and you can kind of build off what you come up with based on sort of like just some internal brainstorming.
Okay, perfect. Well, with that, I think we are just up on time. So I want to thank you both again for your time. Today was excellent. I think everyone learned a lot. Again, for everyone still here, I'll be sending out the recording along with a copy of the slide deck in just a few minutes. And we hope you all join our next Partner Pep Talk. Thank you both, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Great. Rachel. Okay.